All right, let's talk about arrow functions. Who uses arrow functions in the day-to-day? Yeah, a couple people. Awesome. So here's our functions with arrow function notation. Let's see, what are the differences here? We have a big fat arrow. Great. You see that around. A lack of the function keyword is replaced by the arrow. And we don't have to wrap our parameters in a parentheses if there's only one. And also, if it's one line, you don't have to wrap it in curly brackets. Those are the main differences.
So it's only cleaner? It doesn't necessarily have anything beyond like stylistic differences?
Oh, I'm just talking about the syntax right now. It does have a very different behavior than a regular function would. But just like syntax-wise, those are the main things to look out for. And it gets tricky when people start like doing multiple functions, like say this returned something. And then then you want to do something else with it in a different function. It starts to look a little crazy, in my opinion. But the main difference is that it's going to bind the context. And the context is the value that this has to its parent context. I know that sounds a little confusing to some people who aren't familiar with using context. But that's the main difference, really, is that it doesn't own its own keyword this. All functions have a keyword this that gets bound at call time. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the details. I have another course, and there's a lot of courses on here that talk about how that works. But it's important to know that arrow functions do not have their own value for this, and they reach up into the parent scope and grab that value of this in that parent scope. And this replaces, anytime you see .bind, have you guys used bind before? So this replaces the need for that, or it replaces the need if you ever say like var this equals that, and then you refer like that dot whatever. You know what I'm talking about? Have you guys, or self, var self equals this. Have you guys seen that? Because sometimes your context or your keyword this loses its value through, sometimes it's through like asynchronous functions or nested functions. They can lose its value. And so there's some tricks that you have to do to keep this keyword with a value that you wanted. And a lot of times it'll just be the window, and you're like, great, that's not what I wanted. Or take you a little while to figure out why is it saying, can't, undefined is not a function, and stuff like that. So that takes care of that. However, it does get tricky because we expect all functions to have its own value for this, and it doesn't. Another thing is that it doesn't have its own value for the arguments keyword. So the arguments keyword at call time gets bound to all the arguments that are being passed into the function. So the arguments of this, the arguments keyword, is the same as the arguments that are being passed, except it's this object-like array. And that comes for free in all of our regular functions in JavaScript, and that's great. However, in arrow functions, we don't have that. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is just that the variances in syntax can be a bit confusing, particularly when there's an automatically return. I recommend if you're trying to return something from an arrow function, just write an explicit return function because you have to understand sometimes it'll return something and other times it won't. And it all has to do with whether or not something's a statement, and you have to truly understand deeply what a statement is, and that's complicated. So the easy fix is just write a return statement if you're trying to return something from that function instead of letting it auto-return. Cool? Does that make sense? Any questions?
Please just repeat the relationship with the arguments between
Yeah.
the arrow function and
Yeah, so have you ever referenced the keyword arguments in the body of a function? So in a arrow function, it doesn't have that. So it would just be undefined. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Anything else?
Maybe this is a tangent, but I'm curious about in the return statement there. You know, you talked really quick about using backticks yesterday, and I
Yeah.
noticed obviously the $ bracket syntax is different for the thing there. So what all is happening there, and is that something that's ES6 specific? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, so this is a template string, which is one of my favorite things about ES6. Basically, it allows you to, I think it's called interpolation or something like that, but basically you can add variable names in here. So you wrap it with a $ bracket. Similar, if you've used a templating language, it's kind of like that, like Mustache or JSX and things like that. Have this built in. I guess JSX might be a template string. Anyway, point is, you can reference a variable name without having to say like quotation plus name plus quotation. How we have it up here. See this? This is before template strings, so it's just a lot of mess. And then sometimes maybe you forgot to close a string, or you forgot to add a plus on the other side, and you get an error, and it just wastes a whole second.
Sure, and the
Which ends
backticks
up-
are just required to use that template string form?
So this is going to evaluate to a string. It will look up the name, and then you can also like do math in here too if you want, stuff like that. Or if there's a property, you can do stuff like that. Yeah, it's pretty nice.